Growing up, I never went to summer camp, mainly because my parents couldn't afford it. I remember asking one year if I could go, but I got shut down quickly since my parents could barely make ends meet. However, I was able to attend sports camps in the summer. It was similar to your typical summer camps, except you mainly focused on a specific sport. In my case, it was basketball. It was just for 1 week out of the summer, and you would do drills, play games, eat, make friends, and just have a good time. After graduating, my life took a turn in a direction I never expected. I started coaching basketball at the high school level and teaching the fundamentals of the game to grade school children. After a successful first year, as a coach, I reached out to the community to see if a basketball summer camp would be something that they were interested in. I was overwhelmed by the support that I got. So before the end of the school year, I found a gym to rent out and I decided to host a basketball camp for kids from 4th grade through 10th grade. It would be first come first serve, and when all the spots are filled, that would be the end. The camp would be Monday through Saturday, and it would be a sleepover camp as well. And to my absolute joy, every spot was filled within just a couple of days. I couldn't wait to get started in this venture of mine. When we were packing up our stuff on the last day of sign-ups, very angry man entered the gym screaming, saying, "Hey, what do you think you're going? I'm signing up my boy right now. So hold on." I was immediately annoyed by this guy's tone. But I still calmly said to the guy, "Sorry, sir. Every spot's been filled. I apologize. I wish I could take every kid." Well, this guy wasn't having it. He started making the scene, kicking over chairs. I tried to get him to calm down, so I could explain to him why I could only take a certain number of kids, but he wouldn't stop his freakout, saying, I felt bad for the kid, honestly. Thankfully, the kid wasn't with him, so I didn't have to witness that. But I understand what it's like to want to give your kid something, and sometimes the world says no. He finally left after a few minutes ranting about how I haven't seen the last of him. And I'll be sorry. Now as a coach, I have been threatened by parents a million times, and I never take it seriously. Most of the time, parents just want what's best for their kids, and they'll say stupid stuff all the time. So I treated this incident no differently. And finally, camp time was here. I ran the camp a lot like basketball camps I went to when I was a kid: drills, scrimmages, downtime, and even some fun games for character building and team camaraderie. My staff of coaches and I really worked the kids hard on the first day. That first night, almost every camper was asleep by 8 or 9 p.m., which was great for us since we didn't have to try to wrangle and calm dozens of teenagers down. This pattern of hard work and early nights continued for a couple of days. By Wednesday, I only had one kid that wanted to go home, and after a nice conversation, we convinced him to stick it out and stay. That night at around 11 p.m. I was making my rounds to make sure all the kids were asleep or at least in bed and not being a distraction for everybody else. The location of the camp was in an old school that wasn't used for classes anymore, but was updated and really nice. To paint the picture a little better for you, the campers slept in various classrooms. Before you scratch your head and say how before the camp started, we went in and converted the classrooms to some livable quarters. They were much like cabins you would see in an outdoor summer camp just inside an old school. Now after my walkthrough, I was able to confirm that most of the kids were asleep or at the very least in their beds. On the underside of the sleeping quarters was the gym. To get to the gym, you would have to walk down a long hallway and then cut through the cafeteria, which also held the stage where students said one time perform plays and band shows. While I was walking through the cafeteria, I could hear something coming from the stage. I shouted up to the stage asking whoever was up there to come down. I figured it was just one of the kids or a coach or something, but I couldn't figure out why they would be up there. I shouted again, got no response. There was clearly someone up there, because the noise I heard was blatantly footsteps. That was unmistakable. In my stern coaching voice, I shouted, "All right. I gave you a chance. I'm coming up there." I jumped up on the stage and was shining my flashlight all around. I couldn't see anybody, and now I couldn't hear anything. And just as I'm about to walk away from behind one of the curtains, I hear a voice. It was angry and low. And he said, "I told you to be sorry." I shined the light in the dark pockets of the curtain. And from that sort of black void, I saw someone charge at me. Immediately I could tell it was the guy, the angry parent from the Synopsis. And before I could even react, he's tackled me on the stage and started throwing punches into me. One of the other coaches heard the commotion going on, running in, and thankfully ripped the guy off me. This guy was going crazy, flailing all over the stage. I had no choice. But once we subdued him, I called the police. Thank God, they came quick. And they escorted the man out of the building. But believe it or not, this is where the story actually gets crazy. The man's kid was already signed up in the camp. He was separated from the kid's mother and didn't have custody of him. Apparently, the man wasn't mentally well either. Which is pretty obvious. Now, the mother told us and the police that she informed him several times that she signed up their son for camp. And I guess he was upset that he didn't get to sign up his son himself, claiming that it was a father's job or some weird reason like that. It was a very messy situation. And I have to spend most of the next day contacting parents and letting them know what happened and that their children are safe. That was the only incident that ever occurred like that. And I'm thankful that it didn't ruin the camp. It was scary in the moment. And every year before camp, I think about that guy. I have no idea how he got in since all the doors were locked, and there weren't any windows for him to get in. The only thing I can think of was that he arrived the first day and was hiding in the school the entire time that we were there, which just the thought of gives me the chills. It just makes me think even when you think you're safe, you just really never know who might be watching you. When I was in my junior year of college, that was recommended to me by one of my advisors and mentors to volunteer at a summer camp for young teens. The idea of a summer camp wasn't really my thing. But this was one of these gigs that would look good on my resume for a potential employer, given my degree program. And before the end of the year, I researched the area around my hometown and found a camp only about an hour away, and they were looking for counselors. I jumped on the chance. And after a phone interview with a guy named Stan, I secured my position. This particular camp started right after the 4th of July and ran until the 3rd week of August. During the duration, we would see several different iterations of campers. On July 5th, which was the day before camp started this year, I drove up to meet Stan and all the other fellow counselors, the staff, and most importantly, to get familiar with the grounds, which were quite large. I arrived at around 11 a.m. And standing right outside of a big house was a tall burly man, and they were waving. To the left of the house was a parking lot, and the man was gesturing for me to pull in over there. After I parked, I started approaching the man with my hand extended the shake, and the man started laughing in a sort of jolly southern accent. He said, "Hey, we hug around here, friend named Stan, you must be Cassie." Being hugged by a strange man would usually send me into sort of an uproar. But this guy had a real sort of Santa Claus quality about him, just with a black beard instead of white. I realized quickly while talking to him, all the kids loved him and why this camp had glowing reviews. Stan was a tremendous human being, and he just had a presence that you wanted to be around. He gave me a map and personally started to escort me around the grounds. When we arrived at the lake and his still ever cheerful voice, he said, "I'm going to hand you over to my wife now. I have some formality things I need to get done, but you're going to love her and she'll take you to where all the girls bunk." I looked behind me and a beautiful older woman was making her way to the lake. She smiled and waved and an energetic voice said, "Hi, Cassie. I'm Paula, Stan's wife. Let me show you where the girls sleep and then I'll show you where you'll be sleeping and introduce you to the other counselors." The entire walk with Paula was much like the walk with Stan. She was lovely and just a joy to speak with. She showed me the cabins and showed me which cabin I would be solely responsible for, since every counselor would be responsible for one bunk of campers. Then we made our way to a huge wooden building, which was the recreation building. It was where the campers would eat dinner and partake in camp activities. And this is where I met all my fellow counselors, and we all clicked right away. I was excited about the weeks ahead and figured this wasn't the worst way to spend summer. That night, I couldn't sleep. Now the counselors had their own cabin to sleep in, and it was much nicer than you would expect. It was to have us in a room, and the rooms were spacious enough that we would have privacy if we wanted. Since I couldn't sleep, I figured that I would take a walk around the grounds. Now my roommate Ashley was sound asleep and didn't wake up when I left the room. I didn't feel like I was sneaking out, since Stan and Paula both told me numerous times that the grounds are now my home and I can do whatever I like when I'm not with the children. The grounds were somehow even more beautiful at night. The number of stars in the sky was staggering compared to what I was used to. While I was walking, I remembered I had a book in my car, and I figured I could grab it and read it in my room until I was tired enough to fall asleep. On my way to the car, I passed by the big house that I noticed when I first pulled in. It was a big white mansion, and the lights were on inside. I didn't mean to snoop, but as I walked by, just having a glance in the windows, I saw Stan and Paula talking to two men. I didn't recognize these two guys were definitely not staff from the camp. I try not to judge people, but these guys look like pretty questionable folks. The demeanor of Stan and Paula was also different from how they carried themselves earlier. I couldn't hear them, but from what I could see, it looked like Stan was yelling at these guys. I honestly didn't think too much about it. It could have just been friends or even family. And it wasn't my business, and I just carried on as such. I grabbed my book and started to walk back to my cabin. I passed that white house and just kept walking. When I was about 30 yards away, I heard someone shout my name. I turned around and Paula was practically chasing me. She seemed to get defensive and asked me if I was looking in on them or invading their privacy. I was honest with her and told her that I couldn't sleep. So I went for a walk and just grabbed my book. She had a look that I can't really describe, but it felt like she didn't believe me. In a dismissive tone, she says, "Okay, dear. We'll head back to your cabin. We got a big day tomorrow." I went back to the cabin and tried to read, but I was too distracted by that weird interaction with Paula. I thought about it for a while and eventually fell asleep. I woke up the next morning feeling great even with lack of sleep, and the campers arrived and camp had officially started. The week went on and I eventually forgot about my sort of run-in with Paula. And one night, about a week into camp, I couldn't sleep again. It was around 2 in the morning and I was just laying there. I jumped up because I thought I had heard a noise. I went out into the hall, figuring it was one of the counselors, just go into the restroom or maybe even coming back to the cabin after sneaking out. When I got to the landing of the stairs that overlooked the living room, I noticed that all the lights were still off. Even in the dark living room, I could see two figures, seemingly going through bags. There was enough light shining through the window from the outdoor sensor light. I didn't say anything at first, because I still figured that these two people were probably counselors. I started to slowly creep down into the living room, and when I finally reached the bottom, the one figure turned and looked at me. I recognized them right away. It was one of those two guys that I saw my first night walking by Stan in their place. His eyes were wide and his cheeks were completely sunken in. I tried to scream or say anything, but I just felt paralyzed. He started to approach me slowly, and at the same time, he reached for something in the back of his waistband. I finally was able to let out a scream. And the other man grabbed him by the shoulder and said, "We gotta go now." The man never broke eye contact with me and moved backwards until he stepped back through the door and seemingly ran into the night. Seconds later, a bunch of counselors ran out and saw me shivering at the base of the steps. I was stumbling over my words, but I was able to convey to them what had just happened. One of the counselors called Stan, who came down in his four-wheeler right away, and I explained to him what happened, and then out loud in front of everyone. I said it was the two guys I saw you talking to on the first night here. Stan, confused and just sort of laughs in that same jolly voice. He said, "Last week, I don't have any earthly idea what you're talking about. I don't remember talking to anybody that night." And unless they work here at the camp, the back and forth continued for a while, until finally Ashley grabbed me and pulled me away because she could see that I was getting ready to lose it. Stan left eventually and told us that he would be alerting the proper authorities and that we had nothing to worry about. After he left, a few of the guys who left their bags in the living room noticed that their wallets had been stolen. And as terrible as that is, thankfully, not all of us have been robbed. The next day, I told Paula, would it happen that a few of the guys who got robbed, she looked right at me and said, "Whatever you think is going on, you're wrong. There was a terrible incident. And it will be taken care of." I decided to leave right after that conversation. Since I didn't sign some contracts or anything crazy like that, I felt like it was within my rights to just say goodbye. And I marched over to Stan and basically told him that I quit. And so many words. He didn't stop me from leaving, and just apologize for my unpleasant stay. I never pursued this any further and never got really any answers as to who those guys were, what they wanted, and what the relationship with Stan and Paula were. I figured that any legal recourse that I took would basically be a dead end. So I just left it alone. This is the first time I'm telling the story since my brief stay at that summer camp over 15 years ago. I know I made the right choice leaving that day. I had a bad feeling in my stomach that I would certainly see those intruders again if I stayed, and I'm happy that I never had to deal with summer camp ever again. When I was younger, I was desperate to fit in, and I would do anything to be considered one of the cool kids. Now, when I was 15, my parents sent me to summer camp. I was excited at the opportunity to make new friends and hopefully try to convince the other campers how cool I actually was, or maybe even convinced myself. Now, when I showed up, I instantly gravitated towards the kids that I thought looked fun. There was a group of 4 guys standing by one of the cabins. They all had shaggy hair and looked like skaters of sorts, which at the time was what all the cool kids were doing, at least in my mind. Now, the ringleader of this group, which seems like an appropriate way to put it, was a boy named Ross. He was wearing a Dallas Cowboys hat backward and was entertaining the other boys with certain jokes. As I approached the group, I started to laugh at Russell's story even though I didn't get his joke. My fake understanding of the story was enough to be accepted into this group. Now, a few days into camp, it was clear that I did choose the cool group. All the younger campers thought that they were pretty cool, and all the campers our age always laughed what we said. And we quickly became the funny guys, as we're getting in trouble almost daily for fooling around. This was right during the time of Johnny Knoxville on MTV and all that kind of stuff. So we thought we were cool doing dangerous tricks and stunts all around the camp. Ross even convinced one camper named Michael to jump off one of the roofs and one of the cabins onto a tree, claiming that he'd done it a million times. Well, Michael did this. And the tree branch snapped, causing Michael to fawn. I actually think he broke his arm. Russ didn't get in trouble. And Michael was forced to leave camp. And that was the moment that I started to realize that Russ may not have been the cool guy that he thought he was. As camp progressed, I started getting more annoyed with Russ. Maybe it was growing more mature, or maybe I just saw through his little game, but either way, I was kind of going through the motions now. At first, everybody laughed at Russ and loved him. But now everyone was starting to get annoyed with them. And much like I was, he was obsessed with these pranks and playing pranks on campers that he deemed to be nerds or lesser than him. And one night, our group was sitting around our bunks telling scary stories and stories about things that happened in our hometowns. And that's when Bravo stepped in and had to one-up us. In a confident and almost arrogant voice, Russ started to tell us a story. And he said, "You guys think those are scary stories? What do you hear this one?" I was waiting for the right time to bust this out. But tonight seems like a good night. I told you guys before that my brother went to this camp years ago when he was my age. He said that in the woods. There's an abandoned shack. It's not far from here. But it's in the direction that we don't travel for hikes and other activities. This shack is haunted, like actually haunted. The old camp director used to murder his victims in that shack until he was caught and died trying to escape the cops. They say his spirit still haunts the shack. If you go visit the haunted shack on quiet nights like this, you can hear the ghostly spirits of how the poor souls the camp director took. I didn't believe it for a second. I'm not a paranormal guy. But apparently the rest of the guys were, and since they all looked like they were going to cry. I rolled my eyes, and Ross continued to story. Since I didn't believe my brother, he told me exactly how to get to the shack. If you guys are down, we could find it right now. There was an immediate protest from the group. I spoke up first saying, "No way, dude. Not because I'm scared of your stupid ghost. But I'm scared of getting caught and kicked out of camp." Russ laughed and called me something I'm not going to type here. And he always had a way of manipulating people into doing what he wanted. After a several-minute debate, he got everybody to agree to go except me. And I was labeled the coward of the group. He says, if you're not afraid of the ghosts, then you won't mind being the one that enters the shack. If you do that, we'd have to tell everyone here how tough and brave you are. Yeah, sadly, that's what he actually said. And then worked on me. More out of anger and annoyance. I just finally agreed to go. We started walking into the thick brush of the forest. Once the camp lights were out of sight, we turned on our flashlights as we traveled through the part of the forest where there weren't any trails. There was barely any room to even walk. I'm not sure exactly how far we walked. But after a little while, I couldn't believe my eyes. There in front of me was an old decrepit shack dominated by nature surrounding it. I started to hear some of my bunkmates saying no way and other forms of just banter. And I started to think to myself, maybe Russ was telling the truth after all. He demanded that I go check it out. And I was scared. I thought about his story. And even though I don't believe in those just being around this abandoned shack in the middle of the night, after hearing that story, I honestly felt like I was gonna pee my pants. I started to get egged on by the group hearing things like he was so tough what happened and other forms of mockery. I had to check it out, since I did make it here might as well, and I slowly made my way to the door. I barged through, was able to make it inside. And this was bigger than a shack. It was more like a small cabin, maybe the size of a studio apartment or something, or even a one-bedroom apartment. The inside was completely destroyed. And as I walked through and shined my light, I noticed something strange on the ground. There was a bottle of beer, and I'm not joking. It was cold. When I touched her, I could see the perspiration ring from the bottle on the wood floor. I shined my light up, and further in the distance was a plastic bag, and coming out of the plastic bag was an open bag of chips. At this moment, I couldn't put the pieces together in my head fast enough. I was intrigued, scared, and confused all at the same time. In the back of the shack seemed to be a small room. And when I eventually made it to this room, I stopped and shined the light all around you. As the light got to the corner of the room, I saw a woman standing there. And I swear to God, my skin legitimately turned cold. And I immediately felt sick. She held her hands up, and sort of like a quivering voice. She said, "Don't say anything." She didn't look scared. She looked almost angry. Like she was warning me. I heard Rush shot from outside if I was okay, and I didn't answer, because the woman was shaking her head at me not to. After my brief silence, and against my better judgment, I decided to scream the word "run." And I started to run out of the shack. I heard the woman curse something, but I didn't turn back. But I could hear her struggling to run through the shack, seemingly giving chase. When I got outside, I screamed at the group that someone was in there and we needed to run. They all looked confused, like I was messing with them. But then the woman jumped through the doorway, screaming something unintelligible at us. And we immediately all ran back to the camp screaming. We immediately were met by and half the staff who were rubbing their eyes, but incredibly upset that we snuck out. I tried to explain to them what happened. I tried to explain that there was a squatter living inside that camp. But they didn't believe us. They said that they were going to call her parents tomorrow morning, which I was thrilled about. Now I wanted to go home. And then next morning, the camp director came into our bunk and sat us all down. He told us that they woke up early and went to the shack in the woods and saw exactly what we described. They even found multiple footprints that went in and out the other direction. For our safety, they ended up calling camp early for everyone, not just our group specifically. They didn't know if this woman or maybe multiple people were dangerous, and it definitely wasn't worth risking our lives. I'm so thankful that I got out of the situation unharmed. And it's affected me mentally for years. But I eventually came to peace with the incident. I never spoke to any of those guys again, especially not Russ, even though they did say that. It was kind of hardcore to do all of that. At the end of the day, I have no idea what happened to everybody, and it wouldn't surprise me if that idiot's in jail or something. But I'll be honest with you guys, be careful who you trust and hang out with, because they might just lead you into a situation that could be your last. I didn't realize how messed up the story was until just recently when I told my girlfriend and all her friends what had happened. I guess I'm sort of oblivious to certain things. And I'm horrible at picking up signals. My girlfriend was flirting with me for weeks. And I had no idea. So yeah, I'm not the best at overthinking things. Now, years ago, when I was 15 or 16, I don't remember the exact age, I attended a Christian summer camp. It wasn't like in-your-face religion or anything like that. It just plastered that Christian name to get people to come to the camp. In this part of the country, you're either Christian or nothing. My parents also thought that it would be a good idea to send me to camp. They thought that it would help me to socialize and meet friends. And so I am pretty awkward. Well, they were half right. I met PT on the first day of camp and he was wearing a Captain America shirt. I was wearing a Captain America hat and we both laughed about it and instantly bonded. PT was just like me, socially awkward, dry sense of humor and gigantic comic book nerd. We'd spent literally hours talking about comics and what we would love to see a movie someday. And this was long before the MCU was a thing. I believe Iron Man 1 had just come out before campus started. And this love of comics was what ultimately separated PD and me from the rest of the camp. Everyone would break off into huge groups and do all sorts of activities. And we'd stay back just to hang out. We both hated the water. So for any swimming activity, we just sat that out. One day PD brought me a bunch of notebook paper and showed me his skill of drawing. The guy was a freak when it came to drawing. He told me to write some of the ideas for my superhero stories, and he would illustrate them. I loved this idea. It got to the point where I didn't even realize that I was at camp anymore. I was sort of blind to everything else in the world except for my new buddy. And it seemed like he felt the same. We would stay up in the early hours of the morning writing and illustrating our own comics. And one night, one of the counselors decided to do a night walk. He saw us awake with our flashlights drawing and writing, and he didn't get too mad because we weren't doing anything bad. But he still made us put everything away and go to bed. We were annoyed, but neither of us were a rule breaker. So we did what we were told. The next night we stayed up and did our thing. We talked about making sure that we were a little bit more vigilant and if we heard something to make sure that we ducked down right away so we didn't get in trouble. During the night at some point we heard someone outside though. We put our flashlights out and jumped into our beds. We get to hear the walking outside of our unit. The walk continued until it was in front of the building. And the walk was slow, and it just didn't feel right. I thought maybe that he was trying to be sneaky to catch someone breaking the rules. But it felt wrong for some reason. PD and I slept on the far side of the room, so the door was probably 20 feet away if I had to guess. We could hear the door knob beginning to shake. But for some reason, nobody was coming in. PD and I both made eye contact, and he mouthed the words, "What is going on?" I just shook my head because I did now. PD cut up and started walking towards the door. He whispered, "Hey, who is it?" Nobody answered right away. And he looked back at me and shrugged. And then a whisper came from the other side of the door. "Hey, it's John, open the door real quick." We were both confused. There was only one John that we knew at the camp, and he was sleeping in our unit. PD whispered back and said, "Sorry, who?" "Only John Lee knows he's sleeping right here." The voice passed again and didn't answer. And then the doorknob started to shake again. Whoever this was, they were trying very hard to get into the unit. Finally, he'd said something again, "Just open the door, but I'm just trying to make sure everyone's okay." PD made the wise decision and said, "Sorry, ma'am. Counselors have a key, go ask them." He started walking back to bed, and whoever this was started to try opening the door again. We both stared for a few seconds. And then we started to hear the loud thud of whoever was outside. And they were now throwing the body against the door. They only tried to do that about 2 or 3 times, and then immediately stopped. We both got into our beds and just stay quiet. We didn't have any clue what that was about. After several minutes, we heard the door knob one last time, and then it stopped for the last time that night. We heard the footsteps creep by outside of the unit, and then they were gone. The next day, I saw a bunch of counselors talking, and they looked frightened about something. We didn't say anything because we figured that it was probably someone playing a prank or something. And we didn't want to get in trouble. The rest of the camp continued, and PD and I noticed that the counselors were now monitoring all night long. It seemed like one was awake at all hours of the night. On the last day, we told them what had happened that night. And he turned white as a ghost. He goes on to say, "Oh, it was probably just someone playing a joke. Nothing to worry about." He then went and immediately started talking to another one of the counselors. We went home, and honestly, I didn't really think about that incident too much until the story came up organically recently, when we were all hanging out. I'm still incredibly close with PD. And I even called him the night that I told my girlfriend, and he corroborated the entire story. She thinks whoever this Jahangir, who was he, had bad intentions. And maybe he did, his attitude and everything about him just seemed off. And when I think about it, and I think about how everybody acted after that night, it makes sense that it could have been someone with ill intentions. But what do you think this guy have those bad intentions? Or was it simply a camper doing a joke that might have gone too far?